Hi guys, it's Alex here, and today I'm starting a new series on the French defense. The series is aimed at club level players, and it's going to be each video of somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes in length, and the intention is to provide just a general overview in chapter 1 of the main branches of the French defense, and then to do a slightly deeper dive into the independent branches in the upcoming videos. The French defense, I should say, is, for those of you who are unsure, is marked by the opening moves e4 and e6. So this is going to be a sort of player agnostic analysis. In other words, if you want to learn from the black side how to play the French, then hopefully this video series will be of value to you. If you want to learn from the white side, then also it's hoped that it'll be equally valuable. The series is broken down after the moves e4, e6. It is focusing on the move pawn to d4 exclusively. Other moves are much rarer. Black will respond with d5, and you get the typical position here, and now it's where the upcoming chapters are going to branch out. We're going to examine several moves for white. The first is the move knight to c3. The second move is this move knight to d2. The next move is e5, and we're also going to be looking at e takes d5. And these four moves are going to form the structure for our coverage. The breakdown is this video, an introduction, and then the Winnower Variation, Classical Variation, and Rubenstein Variation in chapters 2 to 4. These are actually all arising after white's third move, knight to c3. Then we saw that white could also play his queen's knight to d2. That marks the Tarrasch variation, that's chapter 5. White can push his central pawn, e5. That's the advanced variation. And finally, there is also the possibility to exchange on d5. So that's the exchange variation. It'll be the final chapter that we cover. Without further ado, let's just provide an overview now of all of these moves that have been mentioned. Okay, so now we're going to quickly run through the different variations. But before we do this, I just want to say one thing about the French defense generally. In fact, I want to say two things. So, first of all, pretty much all the major openings are characterized by a fight for the most important part of the board, which is the center. So after e4, the French is no exception, but we can actually think of openings in two broad categories. We have the openings where the fight for the center takes place along the dark squares. The most well-known of these would be e4, e5 positions, or e4, c5, which is the Sicilian defense. However, there are many openings where black's strategy instead is to fight along the light squares. In this case, the Caro-Kann comes to mind, also the Scandinavian, and of course our opening that we're examining now, which is the French. Black isn't immediately getting his fair share of the center on move 1, such as he tries with moves like e5 and c5, but on the other hand, he is preparing the very principled strike here with d5. So this, I think, is very important to know as the first key detail to keep in mind. The second thing I want to say is that after the move d4 and d5, we can see that because black is putting his pawns on light squares in this way, there's one piece in particular that may be quite affected, and that is the bishop, the light square bishop here on c8. We can see it's got its path blocked via this pawn on e6, and even if, let's say, the bishop managed to fianchetto, it still could find itself very passive. So this bishop has historically caused a lot of French players a headache, and in fact, nowadays they have the term the French bishop, specifically for this type of passive piece. So if you want to play the French, this is definitely something to keep in mind, that you have to be careful with this piece. So with that said, let's dive into the variations. Let's give you a rundown of what we're going to be covering in this series. So the next three chapters are going to have to do with the move knight to c3 here, which is the Poulsen variation. The idea is very simple. White is defending the pawn on e4, but is also putting pressure on d5. However, it does set up the possibility of a pin. And so black very often does play this move bishop to b4, and this is the so-called Winnower variation. So this will be the next chapter. And this leads to very, very sharp positions, because what white typically does is he pushes this pawn on e5. Black proceeds with a strategy of pressing the center. This is very typical in a French defense. For the most part, black, it's considered that bishop takes knight is the best way to go. And this position is what we call a tabia, a sort of critical position from which a lot of different things can happen in the French defense Winnower variation. Really very complex position because it's very imbalanced. You have these two pawns here which are doubled, and the structure, in fact, with this isolated pawn is really quite shattered on the queen side, and those are permanent problems for white. On the other hand, white has more space in the center and does have the bishop pair and some serious attacking opportunities with moves like queen to g4. So this is the move of choice for players who like to really try and put the French defense to the test. Of course, after the move knight to c3, black is by no means obligated to play bishop to b4. Instead, he could play a normal developing move like knight f6. And this marks the beginning of the classical variation, which will be chapter 3. Here, white has to react to the threat of taking this pawn, and he usually does this in one of two ways. Either he advances, grabbing more space in the center, something that we've already seen, or he develops and pinning, which is the same principle in operation as before with the Winnower bishop b4. In this way, even if black proceeds with capturing on e4, which he typically does, white can play knight takes e4, and the knight cannot be taken because of the pressure against the queen. Of course, black here will play bishop e7, renewing the threat, and here the major white idea is to capture on f6, and now if black recaptures with the bishop, he often captures back with the pawn, but let's say he recaptures with the bishop, white will now develop the knight to f3. Although black has the bishop pair, in this particular type of position, it's really not a significant advantage at all, since the white knights are very, very strong, especially this centralized knight, and the position is not so open that the bishops exert a big influence on the game. So these are the different possibilities that may arise after this original move, knight to f6. If black instead decides to capture on e4 immediately, that marks the Rubenstein variation, and that is chapter 4. After knight takes e4, black here typically continues either with the move knight to d7, the idea being that at some point black will play knight f6, for example. If knight f3, he will go knight f6, and if knight takes f6, this is in fact the main line, then knight takes f6, rather than, for example, playing the immediate move knight f6, which is playable, but after knight takes f6, queen takes f6, it's not ideal for black that he's had to recapture with the queen, because once again, the general principle is you don't want to bring your queen out too early into the game needlessly. The other major idea in the Rubenstein variation is the move bishop to d7. The point is that black does very often, as mentioned, have problems with this light squared bishop, so what he's doing is playing bishop to d7 with the intention of planting it on c6. Typically, play would continue knight f3, and after bishop c6, there's an attack on this knight, and if, let's say, white plays bishop d3, only now would black develop the knight to d7. So this is really quite a funky setup, but I think a very effective setup at the club level. So now we have introduced the three lines that arise after white's third move, knight to c3, and those are the Winnower variation, the classical variation, and the Rubenstein variation. What else are we going to look at besides knight c3 though? Well, white can actually also put his knight via d2. If he does this, suddenly these Winnower ideas of bishop to b4 make no sense, since if you planted the bishop here, white could just play c3, there would be no pin, and really it's a very useful move for white, and black shouldn't be provoking such a move. So against knight d2, black usually does one of two things. It's either the move knight f6, very normal developing move. This invites white into grabbing more space in the center. Black will play the knight back to d7. These are very typical maneuvers in the French defense. And white will continue his development. Black will now play c5 in order to press in the center. c3 will follow, holding that center, and knight c6. And you can see continuous pressure from black. He'll typically follow up with a move like f6, striking at e5. And in the meantime, white has his own ideas, sometimes even f4, in order to try and hold that center. So that's kind of the discussion that's going on there. Who can white keep the center under good circumstances and sort of squeeze black, or can black break it down successfully? The other option besides the move knight f6 from black is to play c5. And this is something that couldn't be done against the so-called Paulsen move, which is the knight to c3. And that was because from c3, there was a little bit too much pressure here on d5. However, with the knight on d2, not only is there less pressure on d5, but also the d4 pawn is not defended. So this move c5 becomes quite effective, and we'll take a look at what happens in those types of positions. What else? Well, that's already the Tarrasch. So the only other two kind of popular ways, certainly not the only ways, but the two popular responses against the attack of this pawn is either to capture the pawn or to advance the pawn. The advanced variation will be the chapter after the Tarrasch. That'll be chapter 6. And here again, the play is similar. White grabs a bunch of space, but black, his intention is to try and dismantle that center. Very, very quick play. White will continue to defend the pawn. Black oftentimes goes queen to b6, keeping that pressure. White will have to be somewhat careful to hang on to the center, and even just one little slip can actually leave him in a worse position. So certainly a line that white needs to know quite a bit in order to deal with it. The last one is the exchange variation, that is after e takes d5. I figure we should be covering this position since it happens quite a bit at the club level, but in general, if you're, let's say, the French defense player is black, I don't think you should be overly worried about this. It's a little bit dull because both sides have gotten rid of their e-pawn, and so that kind of symmetry invites a lot of draws. And in fact, at the master levels, you see about a 50 to 60% draw rate from these positions, much higher than in any of the other variations. White here typically proceeds with one of these developing moves, either developing his bishop with bishop d3 or developing his knight with knight to f3. Depending on whether black wants to be a little bit ambitious or not, he can either play more symmetrically, going for an equal position, or he can play the move bishop to d6, and then let's say if white were to continue with bishop d3, then that knight could go to e7, just injecting a little bit of asymmetry into the position. It's not much, it's still a very equal position, but there are some chances to win, and certainly at the club level there are plenty. So that's a quick rundown of the different sections of this series. I hope that it sounds appealing to you, either from the white side or the black side, and that you've enjoyed this video. And well, if you have, then I hope to see you in video 2, where we're going to dive into the Winnower variation. So see you there.